All right, we've had a little bit of technical problems. Facebook mucking up with a few things. It's a conspiracy, of course, but we're live and coming to you now. So welcome to Pellowe Talk. And this morning on the live panel, we have Peter Gleeson, who is a commentator on Sky News and a former editor of the Sunday Mail. We also have, what's your current role with Courier Mail, Peter?
I'm a columnist.
And still a columnist, fantastic. And Steven Kilah, who's been on the Pellowe Talk live panels before, a economist and investor, and Brendan Malone from New Zealand, who's in lockdown and got the lockdown growth going on. And it's not Movember yet, but Brendan, you're a bioethicist and regular commentator as well, famous movie reviewer. What else? Do you do?
Yeah, legend of my own lunchtime. You'll see behind me, I've got the essential supplies for lockdown, so we'll be safe here. Don't panic, we're fine in New Zealand.
That's good. So welcome to the show, gentlemen, and thank you for joining. And thank you to those handful of viewers who are with us already. Why don't you share the show on your social media channels and get more people to join in and watch this live rather than later, although later's good as well if you're joining us. It's a pity you couldn't ask a question. So first off, Peter, we're grateful for you joining us. Can you tell me, I want to discuss the role of, I guess, what I've been describing lately as the hyperventilating media, the mainstream papers and news channels that are basically talking like this is an unprecedented health crisis, when in fact what we're seeing in Australia aren't numbers anything like a bad flu season. Obviously, there's some responsible caution about what could be the case. But where's the balance there in future telling and news reporting?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think it comes back to the fact that this is a killer virus, and it's a highly infectious and contagious virus. And I think the projections that I saw from the Premier of Queensland and the Lord Mayor of Brisbane 8 weeks ago would have made anyone's hair stand on end, and that was obviously the worst case scenario. And they kept talking about, we need to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So I think the social distancing etiquettes and protocols, I think the way in which Australians have responded to isolation and making sure that they don't leave their home.
Papers and
I think the response has been incredibly good, and so as a result, the numbers that we in Australia dwarf those that we're seeing in other countries. And I think, to your question, David, the problem we've got in this country right now is that because of the highly infectious and contagious nature of this particular disease or virus, whatever you want to call it, there is no politician that is prepared to pull the trigger on winding back some of the restrictions and lockdown protocols right now, because they realise, just like Singapore has realised, that if you pull the trigger too early, there's a strong chance of a second wave. So I think, when you talk about the media and the way in which the media has approached this, the media, I think, has approached this in a very responsible and careful and cautious way, because there is every chance that if we hadn't have adopted such stringent policies early on, and that, the Prime Minister and the Premiers and the National Cabinet hadn't have been so strident in the way they've warned people to be careful, I think, there's a good chance that this and we would have had thousands of deaths. So I think the media's job has been to caution the public that this is real, that it's something that is obviously a massive killer. And whether we've been lucky or whether it's been through really good policies and ability to flatten the curve, I think thus far we've dodged a massive bullet.
Brendan, what do you think? What's your thoughts on? You obviously have got more perspective on the New Zealand media, but I doubt there's much daylight between the Australian and New Zealand and rest of the world media. Media ratings and politician popularity all go up during a crisis, an emergency, a war or a natural disaster or a pandemic. So there's a vested interest, I think you'd have to say, which isn't to say, too much, but in the context that there's an incentive to dramatize this and whip up some fear and concern. Is it being completely responsible from your perspective?
Well, I think in New Zealand, we're sort of dealing with a different set of issues to Australia. First of all, our media landscape is a lot smaller, and we don't have perhaps the variety of and the breadth and depth of voices and differing views that you have. Certainly, I observe the Australian media from afar. I sort of travel into Australia to do speaking engagements sort of 5-6 times a year as it is. And so observing from here, it's very clear that we are lacking a bit of that breadth and depth. It's almost a singular voice, which that creates an issue for us. The other problem we've got in New Zealand is that our media, because of the extreme nature of the lockdown we've enacted here in New Zealand, very quickly after that lockdown, we lost one of our magazine publishing houses, which included Current Affairs magazine called The Listener. That's gone now. And local community papers were considered not essential, so they weren't allowed to publish. And now other media are starting to feel the economic flow-on effects of this. And so now we're having discussions about the government funding our major media outlets. Now that is where we're starting, I think, to see issues. And what's happened is we've got a bit of a cult of personality that's really arisen, because so far, like Australia, we've managed to avoid the worst excesses of this. But there are moments in the government response that you can definitely point to where missteps were made, and we really desperately need to learn from them. I'll give you one example. Just last night, about 6:15, one of our major media outlets published a story about an audit that was done of our contact tracing units. So, you trace the people who have the virus and get in contact with anyone that they might have had contact with, and you isolate them from society. Now, that measure, when it comes to a virus or a pandemic, is considered to be almost as effective as a vaccine at protecting a society. So it's a really important measure. And for weeks now, the government daily press briefings have been telling us that we've been doing really effective work. Well, that audit that was released last night showed that in actual fact, those units were struggling and that they were not up to standard, and there were improvements that needed to be made. Now, that should have been a much bigger news story, but so far, 12 hours later to almost 24 hours later, there has not been the scrutinizing and the questioning that there should be. And so I think the problem we've got in New Zealand really now is that perhaps we're starting to create a series of things that are coming together in a perfect storm, where the type of questioning that should be going on is not happening. And I think that's the bigger concern for us, rather than any over-dramatic reporting of issues.
Any thoughts on that at all, Steve Kilah? Sorry, just start that again. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, no worries. I think the press is in a bit of a pickle, isn't it? It's damned if it does, damned if it doesn't. But I agree with Peter quite a lot, actually. I think really importantly is the Australian public give the political class a lot of social capital, a lot of social goodwill. And it's a balancing act of how far you can stretch that goodwill, how far you can test the boundaries on that goodwill, that social capital. Because we've had a historically very stable country, very stable governance, a few prime ministers here and there over our time in the last decade. But our politicians are very blessed with the fact that we do give them a lot of social capital, and they get to have a bit of a license with it. At the moment, I think everyone thinks that the government's doing its best in times that have never been known about. So we have to keep watching this space, and we have to keep watching what our civil liberties that we all talk about, how they're going, and we have to keep a check on them, and we rely on the media representatives like Peter and all the other media representatives to talk about what's been giving up and what has been given up to get to where we are. And then, of course, you see a lot of people making comments on, well, when do we start to see the return of what we take as probably for granted, which is our rights, our liberties, etc., etc. So it's a very delicate balancing act, and I think the media so far brings out a lot of good points, and I think it's a testament to it that it's actually a strong and robust media. And I think as we go further into this, Dave, is that people like Peter and the media participants will start to really examine things that are being done under the chief medical officers across each state. So if you look at Victoria with its Section 128 of the Mental Health Act, gives the CMO officer broad powers. You'll note in Queensland that Parliament's going to go to virtual sittings or hardly any sittings. So whilst we have this pandemic, it's the media that represents us back into the political class about parliamentary debates, parliamentary contestability. And at the moment, because of the pandemic, that's not actually being allowed to run its full course. And I think that people will trust people like Peter and the media to put a bit of a blowtorch back on our politicians when it comes to how far they can take away certain things in the name of health. So it's a balancing act that the media, I think, so far has done very well, but we'll continue to have a wrestle with that.
Let's put coronavirus to the side for now. It could obviously dominate an hour. It's a very ongoing and naturally serious concern. But Steve, you've raised something important then, and that is the closing down of parliaments at a time when parliaments are exerting unusual authority and unusual expenditure. We've got unusually low accountability, transparency, and questioning. So, Peter, we're just, 6 months away from an election here in Queensland, and the government is not answering questions. And they're not even planning on reopening Parliament for another 6 months. What are your thoughts? Is this a little bit too cynical from Anastasia Palaszczuk? If Kmart employees can safely go about their job as an essential service, can't our parliaments?
I think it's appalling. Dave. I cannot believe that that the government here in Queensland has gone down this path. Yes, we are in the middle of a once-in-a-generation pandemic. Yes, we have massive challenges around education, around the economy, around the health of our people. But with the right social distancing etiquette, with the right hand sanitisation etiquette, with right adherence to the rules. I mean, here's a premier. Let's not forget this. Here's a premier who sent 3.7 million Queenslanders to the polls on March 28. Local government, 2 by-elections on the recommendation of the chief medical officer, who said that it was fine for people to go and vote. And at the same time, she's telling parents to keep their kids at home and homeschool them. Now, downstairs in my young fella, my 8-year-old, is being homeschooled. I don't have a problem with that, but we're getting mixed messages. On the one hand, the Prime Minister says one thing. On the other hand, the Premier says another thing. If you can send people off like cows to a milking barn to vote, surely the most important people in this state, and I'm talking about the representatives of the Queensland Parliament, should be at their desks today in George Street, at State Parliament, making decisions that are important for we cannot put our lives on hold during this particular crisis.
Very much. Steve, your thoughts on what the government should be doing? Yeah. What are your thoughts, Steve?
Biting my tongue. Need some stitches. So you've got 93 members of Parliament, which obviously constitute our Parliament. And look, I can see what the government's trying to do. And you know how I think. Well, okay, you look at what they're doing, whoever they are. In this case, it's the government, and they're trying to win their next election. That's their strategy. That's their game. That's what they're up for. So they'll do everything and anything they can to win, just like football teams, within the rules, try and win. So it doesn't surprise me if I was coaching them. If I was Terry McEnroth, I wouldn't laugh. That man won, and if I was Terry McEnroth, that's the playbook I'd be playing by now. Very smart man spoke with me, a few days ago, and said we'll probably have a postal election, which quite honestly threw me off. I thought, wow. Thought about it, and I thought, that would be something what Terry McEnroth would actually advocate, because it's a winning possibility. So I get it. With what Peter's saying, I cannot help but concur. It's odd, isn't it? That's being polite, that we can send 3.7 million people 23 days ago to go out and vote, because that's what the chief medical officer said was safe to do. But we cannot put 93 people in a room, which is Parliament. And there's reasons for that. And Peter, you've just nailed it. And there's reasons why they're doing it. And the game is to win an election. And no one's going to say it, but I just did, because it's common sense. That's what's at play. So look, it's a Terry McEnroth playbook. I get it, and that's just what's at play. I'm not surprised, because politicians are in to win power, and we know what that does. They're only in it for two reasons. One is to control the legislation, and one is to control the treasury. And that's the two proponents of being in a government, is legislation and control of the treasury. And that's the two golden assets that you must control and must own, basically at any cost.
Brendan, in New Zealand, is the government there shut down and not meeting and holding regular question times as they are failing to do in Australia?
Well, yeah, there's some big questions about what's going on with our government. So for starters, it is not business as usual, which is not surprising in such a bizarre time as this. But what they've done is they've instituted something they've called, I think it's the COVID-19 Emergency Response Select Committee, which is chaired by the Leader of the Opposition, but they meet on Zoom, so they meet online, and they have experts in to ask questions. Now, it's very clear, though, that while those politicians are doing their best job to keep the government to account, it's not a particularly effective mechanism. And it does leave us vulnerable in a lot of ways. Just last week, for example, our Attorney General, David Parker, was before that committee, and he was asked by that committee about some Crown law legal advice that they were given about the legality of the lockdown in New Zealand. And he said, I'm not going to tell you what the advice we were given was. So they said, well, okay, well, how about you just share it with us, with the committee anonymously? We won't share it with the public. And he said, no, we're not going to do that either. So there's a big problem when you've got things like that going on. And I think what's even more troubling, though, is last week, one of our former and very long-serving MPs, a guy by the name of Peter Dunn, wrote an op-ed column that was published in the media where he raised this issue and said, we need to have Parliament resumed in some form urgently, because accountability is essential at a time like this.
Right.
Nothing risky, but something, basic. Now, that was published, and the reaction I've seen online from people has been to scorn, to ridicule, and to make fun of that commentary. And that's astounding to me, because it's not just a lack of accountability, but it's also a public who don't seem to be very much in touch with the sort of the civic side of their society and the civic life and the political life, to such a degree that they think it's rubbish to suggest that we should have some sort of resuming of parliamentary accountability on a more effective scale.
Now, Peter, you actually shared some thoughts last night, or recently, sorry, not last night, but on the timing of Malcolm Turnbull's book release. We've had a lot of revelations come out from that, a lot of discussions going on. Why don't you just recap for us some of the thoughts that you shared about what that book and its marketing strategy so far seem to say?
Well, I basically said that Malcolm had chosen full time to release his book. Now, others may argue that, well, there's a lot of people at home and they're looking for things to read, but I think it sort of strikes at the narcissism and the selfishness of Malcolm Turnbull that he would put out his book during a period when not just Australia, but the world is sort of grappling with, probably the greatest challenge of our lifetime. And I'm pretty concerned that Malcolm Turnbull has, in so many instances, betrayed trusts, betrayed confidences, betrayed conversations that he had certain people. To me, this is a book that's all about vengeance. To me, this is a book that's all about getting square with those that did him over. No one is unscathed from the Prime Minister down. He basically accuses Morrison of double dealing. He refers to Peter Dutton as a narcissist. He refers to Matthias Cormann as treacherous. His friend Julie Bishop, he says she just wasn't up to it. No one is spared. Barnaby Joyce, he says, lacks judgment. But the really key part of this particular book that I have a concern with is that what Malcolm Turnbull has done is he's erased history. Malcolm Turnbull presided over 32 news poll losses in a row to Bill Shorten. He was no chance of winning on May 18 last year. No chance. And then, of course, when he got done over, he actually said in his book that he did not believe that the Liberal government deserved to be elected. Now, there are calls at the moment for him to be barred to be party, and I think it's incumbent upon the Liberal Party to suspend him. This guy would have been one of the greatest Labor Prime Ministers Australia's ever seen. But in fact, he was a Liberal Prime Minister. He's betrayed all of the core fundamentals of liberalism, of the conservative mantra, and now he's using this book to effectively wreak vengeance on the party that delivered him the highest office in the land. Crazy.
Yeah, indeed. So, what do you think about this this leak of the book that's apparently had millions of copies sent via PDF all around the nation? Is there a nefarious agenda to that from the Morrison camp, or is it even perhaps a marketing ploy to get it in the headlines? Anybody?
You go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. Look, I always tell my children to look forward and not look back. I remember once when I was teaching over there in the south side at one of the TAFEs, I left to go and do something else in business. And I remember walking along the road and just saying to myself, don't look back. Be disciplined and keep looking forward. I think the thing that Malcolm Turnbull as a Prime Minister brings is what's in front of his title is X, EX, X. He's the past. I just made a note. I've got Prime Minister X Keating, X Howard, X Gillard, X Abbott. In this pandemic time, there's two Labor Prime Ministers there, two Liberal Prime Ministers conducting themselves impeccably and not putting themselves front and centre in front of 1.4 million, maybe 2 million, maybe 3 million now unemployed Australians. Businesses struggling everywhere. They have not made themselves front and centre of anything. Prime Minister X Gillard is obviously running Beyond Blue. Prime Minister X Keating has kept quiet. So has John Howard to a good extent, and nothing from Prime Minister X Abbott. So the man can do whatever he likes. His relevancy is he's got his photo or his painting up there in Parliament. The country's got big issues to look at. Incredibly big issues, and he is just simply not an issue. With what Peter said about the party, just look, leave it alone. concentrate on what matters to the people. And the people need health, jobs, and security in their families and ability to pay bills. One man cannot and does not supersede or trump 24 million people. There's a dustbin. The book could go there, or the book can go on someone's mantelpiece. But as of today, at 11:30, 99.99999% of Australians simply couldn't care less. They just want the current government and the ACTU President, Sally McManus, to work together collaboratively to look after Australians right now. So his relevancy is only measured by himself. As for the rest of us, who cares?
Well, we can see here that in Dymocks, it's already discounted by nearly a third, from $55 down to $40 in the bargain bin. So I don't know how many people paid $50 for it, but they're probably kicking themselves right now. They could have saved $16. So yeah, as Peter said, we're going to be probably getting it for $4.99 pretty soon, if you haven't availed yourself of one of those illegal digital copies, which I haven't seen. So yeah, Brendan, how much is this making news in New Zealand?
I've seen a little bit around the fringes. It's not really. It's interesting. Our media, as far as global coverage goes, you tend to get a lot of one-way traffic, and so Trump seems to get a lot of attention.
Yep.
Every time he sneezes, there's a focus on particularly the negative aspect of that presidency. You know, there's as other commentators refer to, you get good Trump and bad Trump. So whenever you get bad Trump, we hear about that. Not so much anything else. We get bits and snippets from Australia. Again, it's that same sort of dichotomy. So in any time that they want to talk about Scott Morrison in a bad light, you know, we sort of tend to hear that, but not so much of the other stuff. As far as this book, we've heard a little bit of it around the fringes, but it seems to me, I think that advice about just ignoring it is probably the soundest advice, in the sense that it's just such a bizarre thing to be doing right now. And it'll be 15 minutes of fame, and then tomorrow it'll be fish and chip wrapper. It just, yeah, and I think it's such an odd thing to be doing right now for all sorts of reasons.
Now, I want to actually just get you to talk a little bit about this graphic that you created. You being in the center of or the overlap of 4 different approaches to the coronavirus thing going on at the moment. Can you just talk us through why you made this? Mike?
I saw there was another version floating around that had only 3 overlapping circles, and I added the 4th one in about conspiracy theories, because I felt it was an essential component that was missing. But here's the thing. What I've seen a lot of arising in the public square, certainly in New Zealand in the last few weeks, is what I would call the false dichotomy and the us versus them mentality. So, for example, we've had a group of experts, academics, who put forward a proposal that the government does need to begin to think. About 2 weeks ago, they put this forward. They do need to start thinking seriously about what can be restarted in the economy. Otherwise, we will end up with a situation where the economic outcomes will be quite disastrous in New Zealand in the long term. So, for example, comparing healthcare systems, our healthcare system is not as well funded, and it doesn't have the same resourcing and capabilities as what Australia does. And so things like your economic well-being become even more pressing if you're trying to fight off a virus, let alone all the other knock-on negative impacts of that. Now, what happened, though, was those academics published their report raising legitimate, very civil questioning, and it was immediately shot down with all sorts of us versus them hostility. They were accused of being greedy, money-hungry people who didn't care about saving lives. It was all nonsense. They were very clear in talking about the fact that this is not a zero-sum game, that there's an equation, there's a balance that's got to be kept and finely tuned to avoid either of one or two extremes, the virus taking hold or an economic collapse that will do all sorts of untold harm and claim lives as well. And so there's been a lot of that sort of false dichotomy thinking where people have, if anyone who's dared to raise questions, as I said, even the most civil, non-conspiratorial kind of ways, there are being, certainly in New Zealand here, there's a lot of accusations flying around that you're not on board with Team New Zealand, that perhaps I've been accused, for example, of even being dangerous and immoral just for questioning things in a very civil and calm way.
Right.
And that's troubling, because really, I think a reasoned response at a time like this, we should not be focused on the cult of personality or the cult of the expert. What I think we need is perhaps what you might call the cult of the question. If someone asks a good question, that should be explored and focused on. And that's not what we're doing. Instead, we've got into this false dichotomy and this us versus them thinking, and that's not a healthy place to be at a time like this.
Yeah, well, I've asked this question, and that's based on revelations that Professor Neil Ferguson is both historically very unreliable with his predictions and models for transmission and infection, and was also the person whose model was relied on by Boris Johnson and President Trump's expert advisors, that they themselves relied on this guy's model. So in 2001, he predicted 150,000 people would die from foot and mouth disease, mad cow disease, if they didn't cull 6 million animals in the UK and economically devastate rural England. Turns out only 177 people died, and well-qualified peers of his were of the opinion that his model had really, really bad assumptions, and he failed to understand how transmission happened between animals. Now, this time round, he predicted that there would be 2.2 million deaths in America and 500,000 deaths in England. And a fortnight later, he predicted that he adjusted his predicament. Oops, it won't be 500,000 dead in England. It's likely to be no more than 20,000 and maybe far less than that. Now, the average flu fatalities in England over the past 5 years has been 17,000. So we've put a lot of stake in the modelling of these experts, which has been somewhat doomsdayish. But is it legitimate, or is it a little bit heartless to question these experts? What do you think, Peter?
I think whenever you get times of uncertainty, whenever you get a massive health crisis like we have right now, that the conspiracy theorists are going to be out there in force. I think that most people would do well to discard 95% of the see and hear around the traps right now on projections about problems and the death tolls and contraction rates, because I think at the end of the day, there is a scientific community out there who are paid, very handsomely to project what may or may not happen. And I think the best people are those who are aligned to government, chief medical officers. I mean, I place great weight in the CMOs, state, territory, and national CMOs, because they're the ones that are getting all the advice. They are highly trained. They have terrific qualifications. I mean, Brendan Murphy, I think, has done a tremendous job in Australia explaining how this thing works and why we should be taking certain measures and protocols to flatten the curve. To be frank, the rest of them, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I write 2 columns a week with an audience of, Sunday 3.5 million and on Monday of 900,000. I'm not going to place any weight in anyone who I have doubts over. This clown that you've just referred to, I mean, he should just hand in his license and never ever start projecting again. I could project better than this bloke. So I think people watching this particular thing right now, place your trust and weight in the people who are put up by governments to get these things right. I'm not a huge look. Dr. Jeanette Young in Queensland, I some average decisions. Approving a funeral for 80 Indigenous people the other day when, the rules are 10, I think was a poor decision. But in general, Dr. Jeanette Young's got a lot on her plate, and generally she gets things right. They are on the side of caution, and I think it's important that we take their counsel on this, because they're the ones who are paid, as I said, handsomely to get it right. So I just think take the government advice. Forget those crazy scientists who are out there trying to peddle misinformation.
Yep. Steve, as an economist, from your observation, do you think the government is getting enough diversified advice? I agree with Peter. We need to give the government experts a level of trust. Is that level infinite? And should we hold them as infallible, or should we be considering contrasting and varied sources of information? And I'm specifically asking about economists. Have we weighed enough the impacts on the population? Look, my position is at any cost is a level too far for most of the experts' modelings that we've seen cast around advocating different policies over the last decade or so. And an at any cost approach is a bridge too far in my mind. What are your thoughts, Steve?
I'll just write three things down. It's very hard to put into an econometric modelling process three things: panic, fear, and uncertainty, because they can't be measured, but they can be attempted to be thought of. So what Peter's saying there is probably pretty much how I'm thinking too, because I'm very fortunate in our family that we've got someone who's extremely qualified in medicine. And I take my lead from that family member. And I'm not going to say who he is because it's private. But I did mention on one of the last shows that, there's a person, Professor David Patterson, who is trying to come up with an answer to the vaccine. And I'm pretty much in agreement with Peter. The economists out there, they all have opinions, and that's perfect. I've got some too. But mine's just an opinion. And at the moment, the best people that the government can get, state and federal, are all there at those tables in the National Cabinet doing the best they can with what they know in times of trying to treat a virus that no one's seen before. So a lot of the econometric modelling is really going in the dark here. They're just doing best case projections, best case scenarios. They've got assumptions left, right and centre. So you have to trust in these medical people. It's all about getting access and direct market access eventually to the vaccine. So no econometric modelling can talk about vaccines because we're talking about science. I suppose people are interested in how much money we have to throw at this. Is it a bottomless pit? Well, that's the trade-off that's going to be happening as we watch countries around the world ask, when can we get our economy back to what it was? So economists have a position, but in this time I think they're being trumped, no pun intended, by science. And science actually for the first time is the king of the field at the moment. And if you would have noticed, that's being completely borne out by the fact that we've now spent $215 odd billion in Australia just trying to get everybody as best as we can somewhere over the line as this all folds out, with a terrible carnage behind it. So science is one and economics is number two. So I'm with Peter and probably a lot of people. The conspiracy theorists, if that's what they are, or so many opinions abound, but you can't listen to every noise you hear. Scientists that are trying to start clinical trials now this week, I think in Australia, in Germany and all throughout the world, because that's what people are really wanting, is a health end to this, and the only way to get it is to get some type of vaccine or therapeutic treatment that can allow people to feel safe and confident.
Now, speaking of science, Brendan, you shared an article from the LA Times, Los Angeles Times. Coronavirus infections could be much more widespread than believed, California's study suggests. And with that, you commented that it was hopeful news. And quoting the article, based on their results, the Stanford University researchers estimated the mortality rate in Santa Clara County to be between 0.12% and 0.2%. By comparison, the average death rate of the seasonal flu is 0.1%. But the uncertain news is that nobody's sure whether someone with antibodies is fully protected from being exposed again and having the disease again. So what is the implications of that science? And I've seen at least 7 other correlating, confirming studies. Brendan?
Well, this is the thing. We're dealing with a lot of unknowns at the moment. And I think what that means is there's 2 things in that. You've got to cut the government and I think those in authority a bit more slack. And also with modelling, that's why modelling can get it so wrong, because assumptions are changing so quickly on the ground now. However, I think the danger, of course, on the flip side of that is because there are so many unknowns, that can also lead to bad policy outcomes and bad decision making based on what you don't know. It's long been talked about in the social sciences that one of the greatest risks actually to people is their intellectual blind spots and the hubris that often goes along with that. A great example of this is one of my hobbies is I enjoy hunting in my spare time. Now, if you go out in the bush and you get yourself lost, one of the worst things you can do is actually assume that you know where you are and then keep trekking in a direction. And that's a blind spot. And what that does is that actually creates a much bigger problem than if you just stop. And so this is the sort of thing that even experts can have blind spots. And especially in a climate where there's so much fear and stuff flying around, these sorts of things can actually create all sorts of issues. So I think that's why what we need to do is I think we need to have a realistic trust in the competent authorities and the competent experts. And so what we need to do is we need to recognize we need those people who are qualified in their fields, but we also need what I would perhaps call a healthy openness within those various competencies where the appropriate sort of questioning and testing of ideas and proposals is actually happening. Because as this study points to, and that is hopeful news, that it is worse than if it's 0.2%, that's twice the fatality rate of the seasonal flu, but it is not 3, 4, 5%. And that is a hopeful thing, but it's still a serious thing we've got to contend with. But this is why we need to actually encourage more of that actual openness of inquiry to ensure that we're getting as much information, because there's a lot we don't know right now, and that includes our experts. There's a lot that they don't know. And I think it's an important and healthy thing to keep that in mind as we process information right now.
Yep. Turning to some of the early casualties from the economic cost, other than obviously our national debt, which may take a full generation to get back to the way it was. Peter, we've seen that Virgin Airline in Virgin Australia is actually looking to not be one of the survivors and looking to be one of the fatalities. They're asking for a bailout. They're trying to renegotiate massive amounts of debt right now. What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of the government intervening in saving a competitive airline market in Australia?
Okay, well, let's unpack this. There's a couple of things that have developed this morning. So they have been put into voluntary administration, which is very, very bad news for this country. I think I host a show on Sky which deals specifically with the plight of those in the regions in the bush. And Virgin was set up 19 years ago to be, a credible, cost-efficient alternative to Qantas, particularly on regional routes, particularly tourism. And when Richard Branson struck the deal with Peter Beattie back in 2001, Beattie said to him, You must service the regions. And he gave a guarantee back then that he would fly into every city in Australia with a population of more than 50,000. And he basically adhered to that particular condition. And he, according to Beattie, he certainly lived up to his word. My concern with the demise of Virgin is that in Australia, a monopoly aviation sector with just Qantas flying will mean big increases, significant increases in airfares. It will mean a deterioration in the quality of the service provided, particularly to regional and tourism areas. I think it's a bad day for this country when an airline like Virgin goes to the pot. And of course, let's be honest here. Virgin were struggling well before coronavirus. Virgin were on their were on life support well before coronavirus, and so to then turn around and say to the government, we need $1.4 billion to bail us out is incredibly rich and difficult to come to terms with. So I can understand the government's decision, but I think it's now really important that somewhere along the line we have people who can somehow rescue that second carrier. What that looks like, I don't know. They have a $5 billion debt, which sort of goes to the heart of the question around the way in which Virgin has been managed over the last 10 to 15 years. Clearly, it's been managed very poorly. But look, I think the overall question is I don't expect governments to jump in and save these particular private enterprises, which are 90% foreign owned. But more importantly, and this is the thing, this is the key thing out of this, Qantas have already proven that when they're on their own in regional Queensland, they price gouge. $1,200 for one airfare between Longreach and Brisbane. You can fly from Brisbane to LA, or you could 3 months ago for $999. They're charging $1,200. I think the bush and the regions are going to be much poorer as a result of Virgin going by the wayside, and I worry about that.
Steve, what are your thoughts? Pros, cons. We've got Eli Wintercross, who's said he doesn't see why we should bail out an airline that isn't even Australian owned, and he understands the concern of a monopoly, but thinks a new competitor will likely arise. Should Australian taxpayers take a punt on the monopoly not being long-lasting, so that there will be the space for a competitor to come in? And are we really investing in Virgin if we bail them out, or are we investing in a competitive market?
Well, I was talking privately, literally this morning, with a lady who, in the north side of Brisbane, whose two children have been affected by what's happened at Virgin, literally right now. So we were talking about this last time. We've got a $1.4 billion request for a bailout, a company that's got 900 million Australian dollars in the bank with a $5 billion debt. As Peter said, it's been put into VA this morning. We looked at those four people, what we call people, four entities that own Virgin, and we found out, obviously, David, that 10% of Virgin was owned by mum and dad shareholders, and we had Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Group, HNA, Singapore Airlines, and Etihad Abu Dhabi government as being the other 80-90% owners. And we talked about this last time. Would they put up their own money? Clearly they will not. And then they want the Australian taxpayer now to put up money to save their investment or to keep their investment going, and that's not going to happen. Now, I've got friends in Dubbo who are regional. Well, actually, they're not in Dubbo. They're about an hour outside, and, of course, they get price gouged when they leave Dubbo to come up to Brisbane to visit their sick family. So Peter is spot on, and I know Peter had Pauline Hanson on last night or the night before talking about regional airline costings and how that's going to affect the bush, and that's something that's extremely worrisome to everybody in the bush. Also, our tourism industry, particularly Cairns, Airlie Beach, is just going to be fraught with danger now that you've got a monopolistic supplier to those tourism areas. I'm having a crystal ball moment, and I thought about this morning. I'm going to take a punt with myself that Singapore Airlines is going to come in and have a crack at this under some private equity capital with a private equity group. It's too lucrative to not give it a go. You've got the Eastern Seaboard. We talked about this on the last show. And you could now have Singapore having direct access from Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne into Singapore, and then verging into the United Kingdom and also through other parts of Europe. And they'd also be able to own a large slice of the Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne route as well. So I think when you see the money is being talked about, that they're going to get a haircut, all these are going to have secured and unsecured creditors have to take a big haircut, and then it'll be open up to new capitalised investors to take a risk management analysis on what they can get back for their money. I think if you look at the ultimate player behind the Singaporean government, which for anyone who doesn't know is the Temasek Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore, which is Singtel, which is Optus, you have to watch what Temasek does on the shareholdings of all the different companies that are around. So look for Temasek, and Temasek will be the player that goes for any particular investment potential that's coming forth with the private equity people as it goes into VA. I think watching Peter show with Pauline Hanson the other night, that there's a lot of blowback from people saying they do not want a particular nation just up to the north there owning anything of an Australian airline. And that was made pretty clear by Pauline Hanson, and you do hear a lot of that, and I think she's representing many people in Australia. I don't know if it's the majority, but it's certainly many, many people that they don't want that particular country to have any of its fingerprints on a second carrier or a primary carrier. We all know that we've had Compass 1, Compass 2, and now we've had Virgin. We all know what happened when we had the airline strike. We all know what happened in Cairns. Noosa became terrible because Melbourne couldn't fly up to it as much. And we just don't need this to happen. But there will be a second airline. The great thing is, and I note in some of the things I've read this morning, and I too do agree, it's not as if you're starting up an airline with 0 aircraft and you've got to get CASA approval. You've got train pilots, train crew, train ground staff, baggage handlers, a highly structured unionised
it's a going concern.
It's got capable people with real planes here. On a side issue, I noticed the American price of oil has gone negative today. So I'm just wondering, negative barrel prices. First time since 1983 that you've now got barrel literally having oil having no value. So I'm predicting that Alan Joyce, being the strategist that he is, will actually now take a large option on buying fuel. Problem is he's got to find a place to store it. But imagine being an airline operator right now and oil has no value, which has never happened since 1983 on the futures market. And you've now got your primary, main cost literally at 0 pricing. If you could buy it now, it'd be heaven sent.
Steve, Peter, Brendan, I don't know if you know this. I don't know the answer to this. But a question from a YouTube viewer asks, can the government temporarily relax restrictions on international airlines servicing Australian domestic routes?
As of right now, the Australian federal government has made the answer to that to be no. They've been sending in Qatar Airlines, particularly for the first time ever, into Brisbane, and that's been able to bring cargo in and only take out expatriate people of other nations back to Doha. And then from Doha, Qatar Airlines has been then taking them back to their respective countries, say America, Europe, etc., etc. Someone made the comment today that they're still seeing Chinese airlines, China Southern, China Eastern, flying in, but they would be bringing cargo between the two nations in, and then they would be taking back out necessary peoples or cargo, Australian cargo, back out.
Yep. What are your thoughts, Brendan, on competition? I don't know how much of an economic philosopher you are, but do you think that with Qantas dominating the domestic market as a virtual monopoly, if not entirely, do you think it's likely that they would raise prices, or would that in turn give them a negative feedback and so few passengers that total revenues actually reduce significantly?
I think it's inevitable, isn't it? That's market forces at work in the world. That's the reality of how things work in the modern world. We saw similar things happen here in New Zealand with what we call our regional routes, which might be similar to what you might call the bush routes in Australia. When we had Jetstar came into that market, and then they pulled out. And what happened? Straight away, Air New Zealand put their prices up. It's just a competition, it seems, is essential. There's a big, interesting question going on here right now. I was talking to someone actually this morning about this, about the idea of a trans-Tasman bubble being developed. If we can, both countries, New Zealand and Australia, can maintain an effective stranglehold on the virus, then it seems possible that we could actually open up an airway bubble that would allow tourism and travel to actually, and that would be an advantage for both of us. I've got an extended family member who works for Qatar Airways, and even they're struggling. I think that something like 50% of staff have gone already. It's like for any airline even to come into a country this far away, New Zealand or Australia, and try and operate would be extremely challenging. Even the economics of doing that it's not as simple perhaps as some people think it might be, I'd imagine.
Do you think, Peter, Air New Zealand might be worth inviting into the Australian domestic market?
Oh, absolutely. I think Brendan's right. I think the trans-Tasman opportunities. I mean, we saw only a couple of days ago the tourism minister here in Queensland rolling out the red carpet to Kiwis. I mean, we've seen the Chinese market really take off in the last 20 years with tourism, but it's always been the Kiwis as our number one market here in Australia, and because of the complexities attached to, as Brendan said, bringing people in and the borders being closed, I think there's a great opportunity for Jacinda Ardern and Scott Morrison to get together and sort out some sort of trans-Tasman synergies, whether it's economic, whether it's aviation, whether it's trade, because there's strength in numbers, and that would be the first step, the first small step in sort of that larger economic picture of trying to get us back on track. So I think Air New Zealand would be a natural fit for a replacement for Virgin.
And as of right now, too, I should say we've got a situation where we've got a lot of our Air New Zealand pilots working in supermarket stores, stacking shelves right now.
Yeah, right.
So there's no shortage of probably good men and women who want to start working, I would imagine, too.
Probably pilots across the world.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. It'd just be a matter of getting a good sign writer to rebrand most of the Virgin fleet to the black and white. Hey, Brendan?
The only condition, can I just say, the only condition attached to that should be that the Bledisloe Cup should be bequeathed to Australia for at least a decade.
I was going to say you'd be pretty happy that's not going ahead this year, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
Let's go around the screen, starting from my right. Steve, then Peter, then Brendan, bringing us home. Just a final thoughts, 30 to 60 seconds, wrap up the hour for us. Yeah,
I think it's very interesting times. I think what Peter was talking earlier about the media being balanced is very interesting. I think the topic that is becoming very interesting now is how Southeast Asia pans out with China and the relationships it has as it develops the Spratly Islands, and you're looking at, what's happening with the Uyghur Muslims, the Hong Kong democratic people being arrested, and their relationships across the South Pacific, Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, et cetera, and Taiwan. You've got 4 US aircraft carriers that are disabled to COVID-19 at the moment. So a lot of attention's being put on to that particular geopolitical options at the moment about what needs to be discussed there and how that all develops in the next time periods.
I think whatever happens going forward, there is no way in the world that we can in China. Any ongoing discussions with the WHO and funding of the WHO has to evolve around the closure of wet markets. We need to take zero tolerance approach to wet markets. They are the source of this pandemic, if you believe the Chinese, because they're saying it didn't come out of a lab. So I think the most important thing that will come out of this is a stimulus to our manufacturing industry. We must be much more self-sufficient and not rely on China as much. But importantly, the number one thing that must come out of this is that wet markets, despite all the historical and traditional aspects of wet markets must be closed.
Yeah, I think for me the Chinese question is hugely important, and it's quite clear that we are extremely vulnerable right now because of the way we've handled it up until this point. I think in the immediate and short term, I think one thing that we've got to be extremely wary of is the emergence of tribalism around some of these big discussions that need to happen as we move forward in the coming weeks and days and months. And I think things like the previous model of sort of social media tribalism, us versus them, my tribe versus your tribe, is really going to do a lot of great harm to us as we move forward. If we allow that to continue, there needs to be, I think, more of a rational, open discourse in the public square. And we need to get down to brass tacks. To do that, though, as I said, we can't have that sort of hostile tribalism that has sort of swamped things in the last couple of years.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everybody, gentlemen, for your time. Steve Kilah, Peter Gleeson, Brendan Malone. It's been a privilege hearing your thoughts, picking your brains, and also to the viewers. Next Thursday, 2 days away from now, at 11 a.m. on Thursday, we're going to be having another Pellowe Talk live panel, and the contributors are going to be the contributors for the Cauldron Pool website. So there'll be 4 or 5 of us there. My articles get published there, so I won't be the exception to the rule, but there'll be the writers, regular writers and contributors to the Cauldron Pool website. So that's Pellowe Talk live panel this Thursday at 11 a.m. Be really good to join in and see what you think about the various articles and issues that are raised and discussed on that website. So make sure you tune in for that. That'll be scheduled later today, and make sure you share it. Thank you for watching this episode of Pellowe Talk. And if you want to get more details, head to my website, which is davepellowe.com, where you'll be able to subscribe to email updates and all the social media channels. And as always, thank you to the Pellowe Talk partners who just voluntarily contribute to the creation and ongoing production of this free content. And until next time, we'll see you in the comments section.